Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Gavin Cleespies. I'm the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm happy to welcome you to our first virtual program. Being our first virtual program, we're optimistic that things are going to go well, but I hope you'll bear with us if we have any minor mishaps. Today's program will discuss three previous programs that we held that were on the American Revolution. They included Professor Eric Hinderaker's talk on his book, Boston's Massacre, Professor T.H. Breen's talk on his book, The Will of the People, The Revolutionary Birth of America, and finally, George Don's talk on his book, Lexington and Concord, The Battle Heard Around the World. George may actually be able to join us this afternoon, so if you have any specific questions for him, feel free to let us know. Our facilitator today is Professor Robert Allison from Suffolk University. He received his bachelor's from the Harvard Extension School and his master's and doctorate in history of the American civilization from Harvard University. He is the author of many books, including The Crescent Obscured, United States and the Muslim World, 1776 to 1820, Stephen Decatur, American Naval Heroes, 1779 to 1820, A Short History of Boston, which is a great book. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to, as well as short volumes on Cape Cod, the Boston Massacre, and the American Revolution. He is the president of the South Boston Historical Society, vice president of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, a fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society and of the American Antiquarian Society, and an honorary member of the Society of Cincinnati. He is a life trustee for the USS Constitution Museum and is chairman of Revolution 250, a consortium of New England history groups involved with the story of the American Revolution. He is also a fixture on local news and media outlets, so probably a familiar voice to most people. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Professor Allison, who will give us a brief introduction.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Gavin, and thanks to the Mass Historical Society for organizing this, a way for us to get together virtually. And I also want to thank Sarah Bertulli, who's been tirelessly working behind the scenes and continues to do so to make sure all of this goes smoothly. And, you know, we have these three very interesting presentations that we have had a chance to look at, which all really look at very well-known events. And one question we always have as historians, and I suppose people who are not historians, is what's the news? That is, what do we have that is new to say about something that is as well known as the Boston Massacre or Lexington and Concord or how the revolution ended? These seem like things that by now we would know, but each of these presenters has really shed new light on these events and made us think of them in a different way. Eric Hinderaker's terrific look at the Boston Massacre, and Eric's real focus has been on the frontier. He's written about Native Americans in the Ohio River Valley and the whole quest for empire, and that gives him an interesting perspective because he comes at this event thinking about General Gage's real dilemma in Boston. And the big story I see from his presentation is the symbiotic relationship between the two best known characters in the story of the massacre, that is John Adams and Crispus Attucks, and really shows how Attucks and Adams really, Adams really creates Attucks as the central character in this story through his argument in court. And also, Eric raises that other question that anyone who has worked at all in the Boston Massacre knows is we don't exactly know what happened. That is, we have the testimony of all of these witnesses, which really disagrees. And in fact, the two earliest accounts of what happened were from divergent viewpoints. The town's perspective that the British soldiers fired on a peaceful gathering, and of course, the perspective of the little pamphlet called The Unhappy Disturbance on King Street, which says that the mob was attacking these soldiers. The point of view that John Adams brings up in his arguments in the case. And of course, the Mass Historical Society's video, which has also been presented to us about the different perspectives, the different testimony, is another piece of this, that we have all these divergent viewpoints. How can we know what happened? And making sense of what happened is also something that George Dawn is doing with his book on Lexington and Concord and his presentation on Lexington and Concord. How did the war begin? As he keeps saying, it doesn't make any sense how this happened. It wasn't what anyone wanted, and yet it happens. And I think partly it's because George Dawn has a background in the military, that he has a certain perspective on this that might elude those of us who are lifelong civilians. And it's not so much that he gives a military blow-by-blow account of Lexington and Concord as he looks at the real conflict between Gage and Admiral Graves and Major Pitcairn, that is three military figures all on the same side, but who have a different point of view and actually different ambitions, different ideas about what should happen. And it is really these fundamental military disagreements are personal or career-driven disagreements between Graves from the Navy and Pitcairn, a major, Gage, the general, all operating with different political assumptions that really drives what happens on the 19th of April of 1775. And George Dawn also makes the point that the king was trying to win this war or keep peace on the cheap. That was what he is trying to do, and one reason why it fails so dramatically, which I guess there is a lesson for all of us. And then also the point about, Franklin's tour of Ireland and the northern parts of England and the misery he sees there, not wanting this visited in North America. So it really is George Dawn's military background that allows us to look at Gage and Pitcairn and Graves, and then of course the British ministries as different players in this who are very much at odds. It reminds me, I think it was Admiral Nimitz when someone during World War II mentioned Japan as the enemy, and Nimitz said, no, no, no. Japan is our adversary. The army is the enemy. So you have this divergent viewpoint. And then probably no one has looked at the revolution in as much depth as Tim Breen has. And his book addresses what it seems to be a very simple question. Where did the revolution take place? And he posits it in these towns, which during the later years of the war, between 1778 and Yorktown, are trying to maintain a civic virtue that is going against profiteers and trying to control prices and inflation. We all know, of course, that inflation was a big problem. And what he's showing is how people in these towns responded to this, trying to restrain people from using this crisis for personal gain. Something about which he says they failed to do. However, it was the very act of doing this, he says, that really creates the revolution. This civic engagement that these citizens in all of these different towns, not Boston and not Philadelphia, are really trying to control their own lives, and doing so by forming these committees to control prices. And it's this very campaign, even though it fails, that brings people together. So three very different perspectives on events which we thought we knew very well, but each of them is really focusing this in a somewhat of a different way and making us look at this again, which of course, when times return to some degree of normalcy, I hope we'll all venture to the Mass Historical Society to start digging again into the great treasures there to uncover new stories and new perspectives on this. So thank you for letting me be part of this.
Great. Peter Drummy would like to ask a question.
Yes, I wonder if Bob can tell us a little bit more about how the image of Crispus Attucks changed over time from Crispus Attucks of Framingham, the mulatto, according to John Adams's description of him during the Boston Massacre trials, through this evolution through the 19th century, where he became a martyr figure, and really the figure, as you said, that describing, writing about the Boston Massacre, this central figure in the story?
I think the big moment is in the 1840s when William Cooper Nell writes his book, The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. Nell, African-American living on Beacon Hill, and he writes this book having Attucks as the first martyr of the revolution, that is claiming him or reclaiming him. You know, John Adams, as we know, does use Attucks in his argument for the court, and Attucks from Framingham, a car from Ireland. And then in 1773, Adams might have penned a short blurb in one of the Boston newspapers. It's a letter from Crispus Adams from the grave condemning Thomas Hutchinson. So even Adams is seeing Attucks as the martyred figure in 1773. That is, Attucks is being used by different folks for certain ends. We know very little about Crispus Attucks himself. Nell reclaims him in the 1840s at a time when the place of African Americans in American society was really being challenged, showing that we've been here since before the Revolution and we have a place here. And then in the 1850s, there is a lithograph, chromolithograph of the massacre, which is much different from the Revere engraving. And I think Eric does talk about this in his talk, that is showing Attucks as a central figure actually carrying a club and grabbing Montgomery's gun. And it's the year after the Dred Scott decision that Boston's African-American community has Crispus Attucks Day on the 5th of March. Boston had commemorated the 5th of March every year since 1771. 1783 shifts the focus to July 4th, but it's Boston's African-American community then that reclaims both Attucks and the massacre and wants to have a memorial to Attucks. And they're really the ones pushing after the Civil War to memorialize Attucks. And so they, in collaboration with the folks who start the Bostonian Society, are behind the 1880s, marking the spot where Crispus Attucks died, that circle of cobblestones outside the old State House. Initially was in the middle of Congress Street, and the star in the center was supposed to represent the spot where Crispus Attucks fell. So he becomes the central piece of this during the abolition movement, and it's really thanks to Boston's African-American community. And then he is the one being commemorated in the late 19th century. You know, there is a playhouse in Norfolk, Virginia, a Black community there, the Crispus Attucks Theater, and other ways his image is used to show the place of African Americans in American society. You know, Malcolm X walking on Boston Common sees this monument to Crispus Attucks. He's kind of startled to see a monument on the Common, and the first name on it is an African American. He said he'd never seen anything like that before. So I think it really is the anti-slavery movement, really Boston's Black community, that brings the image of Attucks to the fore.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. So we have a question that was typed in through the Q&A from the Schoolman School of Education, which says, Serena Zabin suggests that the Boston Massacre was a much more nuanced dilemma because of family connections between army and town. The same could be said of Loyalists and Patriots all over the colonies. Is this taken into account enough when we think of the will of the people?
It's a very good question. I really recommend Serena Zabin's book on the Boston Massacre because she really looks at the occupation of Boston and the personal relationships that develop between soldiers and townspeople. It's not simply the one side versus another, patriots versus loyalists. We've really colored it in that way, I think, as a way of telling the story more easily, not seeing all of these nuances and all of these connections. Now, she combed the town records and admissions to the poorhouse and court cases and newspapers, finding evidence of these connections between soldiers and townspeople. And sometimes people got along very well. There are a number of marriages between Boston women and soldiers who see these soldiers as a way of getting out of the constraints of Boston. And then some of the soldiers, for example, Private Montgomery, he's the one of the soldiers who is convicted. he and his wife and their children have been in Boston, and you keep coming across references to complaints about them by their neighbors. So he had a long relationship. He had relationships with people in town which weren't always good. So you can kind of see this coming to the fore on the March the 5th. So her work, as well as the work of the other folks we've been talking about, does make us look at this in a somewhat different way. It's not simply good guys versus bad guys. It really is a nuanced story, and lots of stories here. And again, the more you delve into this, the more difficult it is to understand how this happened. So we know it happened, and I think really it is for propaganda purposes that each side wanted to make the differences more stark. She makes that case in her book as well.
We do have a question, however, typed in from Jonathan Lane, the coordinator of Revolution 250. He wrote, Dr. Breen and Mr. Don give us two different perspectives of the average New England citizen. T.H. Breen describes the people as of no political background, seeking economic justice in the British Empire. Mr. Don claims that the New England farmers were the wealthiest in the world, by which I think he means among common landowners, afraid that their country will become Ireland. Can you discuss the people of New England in the 18th century, their role in civil government, and their objection to the expansion of British bureaucracy? This is, of course, also a possibility to allow George Breen to also join the conversation. So let me see if we can, there he is. So George, we have allowed you to enter the conversation. We can unmute you. George, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Loud and clear.
So why don't we let Professor Allison answer first, and then you're welcome to add your thoughts.
Okay.
I think I'd rather hear from George first, I think, because he really wrote the book on, and he does make the case very eloquently about these, the farmers in New England really were pretty well off. So George, would you like to weigh in?
Sure. I thank you for the opportunity, and I must say I enjoyed listening to Professor Allison, who is without peer as far as I am concerned. So far as the people who fought, the men who fought, men and women actually, who fought at Lexington and Concord, they were people who were, if you recall, educated. They had access to Boston, were often in Boston trading or doing one thing and another. They were people who attended church regularly on a regular basis, also men who met often in the tavern. And so it was a group of men and women who were well acquainted with what was going on in the world. It wasn't the conditions of people like them in Britain and especially in Ireland wasn't a mystery, and they knew what the issues were and what they were fighting for in the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Large numbers of them, of these educated, well-off farmers, large numbers of them came out and risked their lives. And people like me, in first seeing this and coming across it many, many years ago, wonder why. Why were they fighting? Why did they risk death? Why were they protecting what they had? How much did they have to protect? How much were they thinking of their families, and so on? And the other thing about them that has not been emphasized enough is that many of them were veterans of the French and Indian War. So they were experienced fighters. They knew what what war was about, if they had no real interest, personal interest at the time of Lexington and Concord, then these experienced fighters probably would have found some way to avoid service. Instead of that, they turned out on that day to fight in record numbers. General Gage in Boston was surprised. He was surprised by their numbers, but he was surprised about their enthusiasm and how they came together and how they were so well organized. These are not some simple peasants. They were much more than that. And I would like to mention Ireland in this context, because Ireland has not received very much interest from people talking about Lexington and Concord, but conditions in Ireland for people, Irish Catholics, of course, were abysmal. I spent some time in my book explaining how Benjamin Franklin felt when he first saw conditions in Ireland. Of course, he had read about Ireland, but when he first saw it in some detail, how these people were being treated, worse than slaves, perhaps you'd say, then you'd have to believe that the men at Lexington and Concord, the fighters, the American fighters, didn't want that kind of thing imposed on them. Maybe it wasn't what the king intended, but they didn't want to risk it. So I hope that answers to some degree your question.
Thank you. Very good. Very well put. Yes. And there's a story that David Hackett Fisher tells in one of his books. Actually, it's a 19th century historian in one of the towns of Massachusetts who learns that there is
one of our great historians.
Yeah. Well, and he knows there's a veteran someone who had answered the alarm at Lexington and Concord, living in the town. He says, well, this is my chance to interview him. So he goes to talk to this old man and says, well, what was it that made you turn out? Was it the Stamp Act? The old man says, I don't think the stamps ever were unloaded. He said, well, was it the Tea Act? He says, well, I never drank tea. Was it the Intolerable Act? He says, well, I'd never heard of them. And this frustrated historian who knew the answers then says to him, so what was it then? And he says, well, we had always governed ourselves. They weren't going to let us do that anymore. We couldn't allow that to happen. So it really is this change in British policy, I think, as they're trying to bring these people into the empire. And these people already were in the empire, but were used to governing themselves. People in Massachusetts had more power over their own affairs than anyone else in the empire. And the imperial reforms were going to constrain that.
That's a wonderful point. And I remember reading that years ago and thinking that it certainly was one of the attributes of these fighters.
Yes. Well, thank you, George. Thank you. Great to hear from you.
A question that was typed in from Beth Bauer, who says, Breton seems to downplay actions against loyalists during and after the Revolution. Wasn't there instances of loyalists being quarantined or moved out of their communities?
Yes, there were. Yeah, loyalists. The loyalists really are the losers. And there is some reconciliation, but not a lot. And Massachusetts is somewhat unique because it does seem like the division between loyalists and patriots. There were fewer loyalists here. Many of them, about 1,000 left on March 17th of 1776. Other places like the Carolinas or New York, where there are more loyalists, and in New Jersey, you see much more violence against them and much more people being ousted, people having their property seized, and so on. The war really becomes a civil war in South Carolina, North Carolina, as lots of pre-existing grievances come to fore. And so Massachusetts is somewhat unique. We do kind of sanitize the story here because we don't want to make it seem like our side was so vicious, but they were. I mean, he does make a good point about not having the kind of bloodbath they do in France or in Russia or in Saint-Domingue. But still, there was that ousting of loyalists. Tarring and feathering is not a pleasant thing.
Okay. Thank you. So we have a question from Fred, and I think that I may allow Peter Drummy to also come into this because I think this speaks directly to our exhibition at MHS. So Fred says, is it true that there was a nearby fire with citizens calling the fire brigade by yelling fire, and that might have been misunderstood as a military command to the British? So the exhibition at MHS is called Fire, Voices of the American Revolution. So that's why I thought it was worthwhile bringing in Peter, who curated that show.
Peter, do you have anything to add?
I think this is a really interesting point because what happened was that the church bells rang that evening, which was an alarm signal. And in a town made up primarily of wooden buildings, fire is a great danger. The fire department is essentially volunteers, organized volunteers in different parts of town. So what happens is people come out on the street thinking they're answering a fire alarm. Some are carrying bags or sand, things that you would use fighting a fire. And then they discover in this dark late winter night that, as one of the witnesses says, there's something better than a fire. There's going to be a fight. And it's sort of used, this fire alarm isn't used to answer an actual fire, but to bring people out in the street who then participate or witness what happens thereafter. I think that's how this is understood. Not an actual fire, but the use of the fire alarm system to arouse the population.
Yeah, that was my understanding too. So people are coming on the street shouting, "Where is the fire?" And also they're shouting at the soldiers, "Why don't you fire?" So the word that soldiers keep hearing is fire, and people are coming onto the street with their bags and their other firefighting equipment, which then become weapons.
Yes, this is one of these. This is why we use this as the title of our exhibition. This sort of change from fire meaning fire alarm to fire meaning try to taunt the soldiers to fire without permission or fire without the riot act read to actual firing that takes place.
Thank you.
Great. So we have a question from Dr. Michael Shire, who says, Robert Harvey in A Few Bloody Noses offers an alternative British view of the revolution. He suggests that the restrictions of westward expansion was a key factor in the Patriot opposition. Do you feel that views from England need to be added to more traditional views from the American side for reasons for the revolution?
Yes, and I think the revolution does look differently wherever you're standing. And certainly one of the big grievances in Virginia was shutting off of the West, shutting off of the Ohio River Valley to white settlement. And thus the Virginians had a lot invested in the Ohio River territory and what becomes Kentucky, as well as on the north shore of the Ohio River. And it was the British attempt to constrain the white settlement on this side to keep and if you read Gage's papers, and both Eric Hinderaker and George Dawn make this point about how much differently things look to General Gage than they look to us. his concern really isn't what's happening in Boston at the time of the massacre. It's what's happening in Illinois, and it's what's happening along the Ohio River. He's not really interested in what's going on in Boston. The British focus really was on the interior, on the West, and it was the proclamation of 1763 shutting it off that really is a grievance in Virginia, in a way that the Quebec Act was a grievance here for a different reason. The Quebec Act of 1773 extends the boundary of Quebec into the Ohio River Valley, which pretty much shuts off Virginia's attempts to claim the area. The Quebec Act in Massachusetts was upsetting, and because it allowed the Roman Catholic Church to exist in Quebec. And the Protestants here in Massachusetts were just aghast. Some of the Protestants were just aghast at the idea that the papists will be allowed to practice their anti-Christian religion in Quebec. I'm using those phrases, papist and anti-Christian, in quotes, so I don't want the MHS to feel they have to say they're disavowing what the views of Professor Allison are not necessarily his own or those of the MHS. We should have made that clear at the beginning.
Thanks, Bob. So we had another question that said, could you ask George and Bob, Dr. Don and Dr. Allison, about the role of the British Army and the Royal Navy in the coming of the Revolution in Massachusetts?
That's a very good question. I will defer to Dr. Don.
Well, it's a huge subject, but before I say something about that, I want to say that the British King was for a very long time concerned about the westward expansion of the 13 colonies because he felt that they were going to become very powerful, and if this continued on the way it was going, they were going to become also independent inevitably and would become more powerful in many ways and a challenge to Britain. At that time, a very large percentage of the British merchant fleet was being built in American yards, which wasn't appreciated, but His Majesty, who was a very diligent, hardworking monarch, paid attention to a lot of different things, and this westward expansion bothered him probably more than anything else, and one of the important reasons why he wanted to reverse course here.
Yes, it was. Did you want to say something about the role of the Army and the Navy?
Yeah, I would. This is the role of the British Navy has been more or less left out of the early Battle of Lexington by Lexington and Concord, I mention it in my book at length because of the relationship between the Admiral in Boston and General Gage was of great importance, and if the two of them had been able to work together, which they could not at all, I don't think the outcome necessarily would have been different, but the course of the battle would have been different. And I didn't explain that too much in my book because I just didn't have enough space. But that relationship between the Army and Navy throughout the Revolution would be of critical importance. And one of the areas that has been ignored by historians is recounting the interplay between Army and Navy throughout, British Army and Navy throughout the Revolution. And I would say that the final battle of the Revolution in Virginia would have been quite different had this relationship been different.
Yes,
so,
you're right.
Did you have anything to add, Bob, or is that?
I think he covered it.
Okay. So Patrick O'Brien says, thank you, Bob, and everyone at MHS for producing this. Being down here in South Florida, it's great to be able to interact. I want to ask a question about how historians have treated the Loyalist over time and its connection to the understanding of patriot ideology. One of the earliest historical depictions of the Loyalists was created by Mercy Otis Warren. It's not a surprise that who is perhaps her most useful Loyalist, Thomas Hutchinson, came from her native Massachusetts. But in focusing on Hutchinson's character, Warren painted a lasting image of the Loyalists, especially those of New England, as greedy mercantilists. More recently, historians have demonstrated the incredible diversity of thought and allegiance among the Loyalist population. Has this appreciation helped clarify patriot ideology or complicate it?
It really has done both. I know Mercy Otis Warren, as Patrick O'Brien says, really was not a disinterested observer. She is a polemicist. She was a polemicist before the war, really writing scathing things about Governor Hadall. So it's no surprise when he loses. And, there's a Revere woodcut of on the Boston Almanac, the wicked statesman at the hour of his death in 1773, and the devil is making him sign his confession of all of the terrible things he's done. And Hutchinson, in a different age, probably would have been a college professor. He wrote a monumental history of Massachusetts, and volume 3, the pages were scattered in the street when the mob attacked his house in 1765, and one of Hutchinson's friends said apparently no one wanted to read another volume of his wretched history. This is what his friends are saying about him. And so, yes, looking at Thomas Hutchinson, kind of misinterpreting him, I'm not here to clear his name. John Tyler is working on the papers of Thomas Hutchinson, which really does give us a good view of this. But yeah, since then, and actually since in the last 20 years, there's been much more attention paid to the Loyalists, the loyal Americans, and what they were trying to preserve. And there's some ambiguity about the role of Benjamin Franklin, whose son is the governor of New Jersey and becomes the leader of the Loyalists in London. And Franklin disowns him. That is, Benjamin Franklin disowns his son, who remains a leader of the Loyalists. There's more thinking about what they weren't self-interested. It's easy to look at them as the idle rich if you see the houses on Brattle Street in Cambridge. But there's a much more interesting picture of them. A lot of the people who leave as Loyalists are African Americans, and they see that actually their chances are better with the British Empire than with the emerging American polity. So it causes us to rethink a lot of the things we might have learned in third grade about the good guys, the bad guys, and who are the forces of righteousness. On the other hand, we know ultimately the revolution is going to lead to questioning of the institution of slavery. So it complicates it, which makes history much more interesting. So thank you.
So we have 2 people with their hands raised. So just because this one's on top, I'm going to go to at 9 Rockland 78.
Hi, this is PJ. Hi, Professor Bob. How are you?
Good. How are you doing, Pete?
Good, thanks. I do have a question, and I'm always curious about this, especially when I'm out in Lexington and talking about the alarm. And we always talk about the militia companies and how each town or many towns had a militia company. But my question relates to that period between Lexington and Concord and the Battle of Bunker Hill, when apparently there were probably about 2,000 militiamen gathered in Cambridge. And I'm always wondering what type of military order or organization existed before Washington came on the scene. I know that Putnam was there, I believe he was there, and I'm not sure if he had the title general or not, but I'm always confused between the difference between the local town militia companies and whatever other army structure involved at that time up here in New England.
That's a very good question. And it's one of the reasons why Washington came on the scene, was because of all of the confusion. each town would have its militia, and bigger towns, sometimes towns would have multiple militia companies. And typically these were organizations that were partly defense organizations. I mean, George was making the point earlier about how much fighting had gone on during the 7 Years' War. So there was this very well organized militia then. Each town had, every man between the ages of 16 and 60 would be part of the town militia. And then you would turn out to drill and to train. And also you would elect your own officers. So in the case of Lexington and Concord, there is the alarm. The militia are called out, and then they pursue the British back into Boston. And then they remain from essentially Prospect Hill in what's now Somerville to the west. And it's an arc really from there, Prospect Hill, through Cambridge, and then across the Charles River and into Roxbury, holding the British in Boston. And it's not clear who's in charge. Artemus Ward was I believe he was the adjutant general for Massachusetts. So he is the highest military figure in Massachusetts. However, there are also militia from Connecticut and from Rhode Island and from New Hampshire. And they don't need to listen to anyone from Massachusetts. And each colony is responsible for paying its own militiamen. In Massachusetts, you're paid every month, but you're paid by the lunar month. Connecticut and Rhode Island pay you on the first of the month. So there's a disagreement there. And of course, different colonies had, different numbers in a battalion. It's 1,000 here, it's 900 here. So you have this welter. We don't know how many there were. The first thing Washington wants to know is how many militiamen are there, and no one can tell him. There's always a different reason, and it takes months before he can find out how many men he has. And one of the big reasons why Massachusetts pushes to turn these militia into a Continental Army is because you have these 10, 15, 20,000 armed guys camped out essentially, and they don't really think they need to listen to anyone. I mean, they're here doing a great public service. Why should we be telling them to dig latrines and not relieve themselves behind every bush they can find? Why should we tell them, no, you can't, it took about a week to clean up the, what's now the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, after this Gloucester unit had been occupying it. Washington wants it for his headquarters. It takes them a week to clean it before Washington actually can occupy it, because these guys, aren't really preserving decent hygiene. In fact, it's one of the things that impresses Washington about Nathaniel Greene, whom he meets in Roxbury. Greene had brought his Rhode Island troops to Roxbury, and Washington is really impressed with how clean the camp is. That Greene's men had dug proper latrines, which is something none of the guys camped out in Cambridge or in Charlestown had done. And this is what brings Greene to Washington's attention. He immediately has his unit move over here. So great question. And it's very complicated because each province had its own rules about the militia. And then they get here and there's also a lot of fighting going. I mean, one reason you might join a different militia company that I'm in is because you don't like me. So a lot of these towns have militias which actually don't get along with each other. So turning this into a Continental Army is actually one of the real feats that Washington is able to accomplish.
Okay, so we have another person with their hand raised whose name is Nina Sankovic. So I'm going to allow her to speak, and you should be able to speak now. Nina, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you. I would love to hear Professor Allison's take on the role played by colonial pamphleteers. And I'm thinking specifically of Josiah Quincy Jr., but of course there were others. And what role did their writings play in stirring up the colonists, against British rule?
That's a very good question. And it's extraordinary, going back to something George said earlier about this being a very literate population. And there are very few ideas they have that aren't written down and printed. And Massachusetts, back in 1720, there were only 8 printing presses in all of British North America. 5 of them were in Boston. So even this was a very literate population. And Quincy is a fascinating figure because he understands the catastrophe that is looming. He's the patriot, that becomes his nickname. And yet he understands how bad the war is going to be. And so on the one hand, he is writing to kind of marshal support for the patriot cause, but he also sees the real danger of what is going to happen. It's at the one of the meetings preceding the destruction of the tea, where he says that the question isn't going to be resolved by high-sounding speeches echoing through this hall. It's going to be decided by the bloodiest conflict this continent has ever seen. But it's the ideas in these pamphlets, as well as I think we live in a more secular age, and sometimes we obscure the real role of the clergy in this. There's a member of Parliament who visits Boston, and he reports in Parliament that he had knocked on a door in Boston. The servant answered, and he said, "I'm here to see your master." And this young woman said to him, "I have no master but Jesus Christ." That is, these people all felt that they were, their only real hierarchy is the religious one. And they say that this is something being preached in their pulpits. And, William Billings' song, which he first wrote in 1770, there were verses added later about "Let tyrants shake their iron rod and slavery clank its galling chain. We fear them not, we trust in God. New England's God forever reigns." They have, this is what they know is what God wants. And the sermon literature really morphs into this patriot literature at the time of the Revolution. So yeah, it is because it's a literate population that has these ideas. I think the connection we historians really struggle to make is how you go from people writing pamphlets to people shooting at each other. It's one of the things that really makes this period so fascinating.
Great. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Nita.
So we have a question that was sent in by Alex Orzoko. He says, "I'm working on a paper about the birthplace of the Mexican Revolution. As a part of my research, I reviewed the history of the American Revolution. I was fascinated to read about the ongoing debate or dispute between Lexington and Concord over, I lost my place again, I have to stop doing that, over which one is the actual birthplace and the similarities to the two towns, in Chihuahua, Mexico, where there's a similar dispute. Could you comment on the Lexington versus Concord debate? Given your own expertise, do you have an opinion on which one is the real birthplace and why?"
Well, at the risk of alienating everyone I know in Lexington and everyone I know in Concord, I would actually say neither one is. I don't want to fault them for claiming it. We hear Massachusetts observe Patriots Day. That's a long story about how Patriots Day became Patriots Day in the 1890s. Lexington observed Lexington Day on April 19th. Concord observed Concord Day on April 19th. And the other 349 towns didn't observe either Lexington or Concord Day. And then when there was a need to have an April holiday because we were doing away with Fast Day, the governor, I think it was Ames, searching around for an alternative, and Lexington proposed Lexington Day, and 350 towns said no to that. And then Concord said, "How about Concord Day?" 350 towns said no to that. And then they got together, a rare moment when Lexington and Concord got together and said, "Let's have Lexington and Concord Day," and 349 towns said no to that. By the way, if we're on this subject, anyone listening in Arlington is going to be really upset because Arlington had more fighting on April 19th than Lexington and Concord put together. The bloodiest fighting was in Arlington, which then was monotony. So yeah, war breaks out there at Lexington and Concord. There's a long buildup, which I see happening in lots of other places around the Commonwealth. And I don't want to take away from either Lexington or Concord. Often you'll hear someone talk about the shot heard round the world fired on Lexington Green. Actually, the poem the song from which that line comes was about Concord. So having said I'm not going to weigh in on this, I've now gone on for about 10 minutes about Lexington versus Concord. I don't have a position on which one deserves primacy. I'm glad that people turned out in both. So, but thank you. And I really admire you for beginning your research on the Mexican Revolution by looking at the American Revolution. You can see you'll go down lots of rabbit holes in the American Revolution. I wish you well with the Mexican Revolution.
Thank you. So it's about 2:53, so I think we have time for one more question. So we have one more that was sent in by Randy Biddle, and it says, as a vessel biographer for a few 18th century merchant sailing ships, I have studied colonial Boston newspapers. Considering the delays in getting news back and forth from England to the colonies, I have wondered whether actions or reactions taken by Parliament, naval or army commanders, or the rebels were judiciously reconsidered or delayed as well. In contrast to our nearly immediate access to information today, its veracity or lack of it notwithstanding.
That's a very good question, because there is this time lag, and you never know. So Gage here is operating on old information. That is the Lexington and Concord. I mean, the most recent news he had from London was February, when the king says, and Parliament says, let's start getting tough with them. And also we're sending over more troops to help things out. And so he sends out the expedition to Lexington and Concord in April with this news that he's received as of February. And then more troops are on their way with 3 more generals, Burgoyne, Howe, and Clinton. And they had left London knowing that, yeah, there's a minor rebellion going on in Massachusetts. And they arrive here in May, and to find that the town is actually surrounded by 20,000 rebels. So the situation had changed, and it continues to change. And there always is a campaign before the war starts to let's get our story there first. It's one of the reasons the town writes its account of the Boston Massacre. It's not so much so people in the town can read this, but they want to get it to London. And there's also someone else writing to London with this. And actually, Andrew Oliver, who is the secretary of the Governor's Council in Massachusetts, sends the minutes of the council meeting to London. And when news comes back to Boston, that the council meeting's minutes had been sent to London, this is really one of the things that turns the massacre into a big political event, because it's in the fall of 1770, long after the event, when suddenly members of the Governor's Council find out that what they had been saying on March the 6th had been reported back in London by a member of the council. And the former members of the council all condemn Oliver for this breach of their secrecy. So you have this big distance, which causes problems. And it's this time lag in getting information and not believing if the information is true or not. And sometimes ships disappear. And so you don't know exactly what happened. So the point you made about now we have almost instantaneous communication, but we still know how quickly disinformation or misinformation can spread even with that.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Professor Allison, for sharing your Friday afternoon with us. I think it's impressive that we had this program, and we had 95 people at the end of the program. So I'm very pleased with the turnout. We hope you enjoyed these programs during these unusual times. We are working to continue to bring interesting and educational contents to our members and publics. We understand that many people are experiencing financial hardship at this point, so we're offering all of our programs for free for the next 2 months. However, if you have the financial ability and would like to express appreciation for our programs, you can do so by visiting our website. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.